Okay, it's getting a little bit tedious, I got to be honest with you, for me to keep typing over and over again. Please go review the thesis statement resource that I've provided for you. Now, I get that thesis statements are something this was supposed to have happened for you in freshman composition wherever you took that, and I know when I teach English 1A, I drill my students to death about thesis statements because I don't want to have to come back in advanced classes and teach it again. But I'm finding myself typing over and over again on too many papers, please go review the thesis statement resource. And then on the next paper, finding clear evidence that in fact that student did not go review the thesis statement resource. Because no positive change has been made. So we're going to do it together this week in the interest of getting everybody on board. So that's the first thing. The second thing is your colleague's essay that you looked at last week, the third one that you looked at last week. I chose that one deliberately because that one wasn't really that bad. That one had a particular issue with the thesis statement that's easy to identify and easy to fix. And that student, by the way, chose to identify herself, and that's fine, but it's not required that one identify oneself. When I give you student essays to look at, your colleagues' essays to look at, I think it's useful for you to see that other people in the same class you're in with the same instructor you have struggling with some of the same issues, and to see how they solve that problem. Does that mean you should solve the problem the way they solve it? No. Does it mean you should compare yourself to them? No. The purpose of this exercise is not to get you to compare yourselves to each other. That's a useless and fruitless exercise. But I guarantee you, if you apply the principles of this class, you applying the principles will be better than you not applying the principles. Can you compare yourself to anyone else in the class? Should you compare yourself to anyone in the class? No. Should you compare yourself to you doing these techniques and you not doing these techniques? Absolutely, because you will get better. So, and let me talk a moment about the way I grade papers. I haven't really maybe shared my theory with you. When I sit down to grade a paper, it's my job to be supportive and guide you and help you learn. But it's also my job to point out, like right here, you could have done a little better right here, and here's the way you would improve that piece, to give you specific practical advice that will guide you to doing better. So when I sit down with a paper, my approach has always been, and this is why I'm a slow grader, because my approach has been, okay, I've got this paper. What would I do if I were writing this paper? What responses would my mind produce for me if I were writing this paper? And then, given my repertoire of skills and training and experience, I could say, okay, you've encountered this problem, and that problem, when I encounter it in your paper, that's no longer your problem, that's a problem I have encountered in my writing because I'm pretending that I've written your paper. And then I say, okay, I made this mistake right here. Where would I go to fix it? How would I recognize it? And where would I go to fix it? So when I sit down with a paper of yours, my advice to you is based upon my experience of what I would do if I were writing this paper. And the reason I picked the particular paper that I did was because it had a very clearly definable issue that was very clearly fixable. Ladies and gentlemen, I get papers sometimes that I sit down with them and I try to put myself in that person's shoes, and there's nothing there. And I frankly don't always know how to help those people. Some papers I get are such a mess, I don't even know where to start. And it's likely because the student themselves doesn't care that much about the work, or doesn't approach the work using the techniques that we've taught. But this paper, your colleague's paper from last week, the example number 3, I said, well, if I were sitting down and I were writing this paper, I would notice that there are issues with the thesis statement, and then I would, because I identified the problem, I would know how to fix it. So let's go back and take a look at that paper. If you want to pull it up from last week, it's a colleague's paper number 3 in the forum from last week. First off, I asked you, where's the thesis statement and how do you know it's the thesis statement? I have your colleague's paper here on my screen and I'm looking at it. So the answer is, I know that's the thesis statement, or I think that's the thesis statement because it's in the place where the thesis statement goes. Thesis statement goes at the end of your intro, not hidden in the middle of your intro. That's not the best place to put it because your reader won't see it there. You have a 4 or 5 or 6 or 7 sentence introduction. At the end of that introduction, the last sentence is your thesis statement. That's where it goes. So I know that's where the thesis statement should be, so that I'm looking for it there, and sure enough, there's something that looks like a thesis statement. So the answer to the first question is, I know it's the thesis statement because it's where the thesis statement is supposed to be. That's not rocket science, folks. It's where it's supposed to be, so therefore that's what it is. The question is to judge whether it's an adequate one or not. And that thesis statement, remember, you were supposed to pick 3 elements. If you look at that thesis statement, go back and look at it, point of view, characterization, and literary techniques. Well, literary techniques is not an element. Literary techniques is an umbrella phrase. All of them are literary techniques. So there are really only 2 pieces of that 3-part thesis statement that are relevant to the topic and to the project at hand. So the first thing I would notice if I were writing this thesis statement is, well, literary techniques is not a thing. You know, point of view is a thing, characterization is a thing, setting is a thing, dialogue is a thing. Literary techniques is not a thing. Literary techniques is a category. So I would know to fix that. Okay. The other thing I would notice is that this thesis statement is announced. The other ones that I will be analyzing. Okay. So in the PowerPoint that you're going to be looking at this week, one of the most important pieces of advice that's given is don't announce your thesis. Don't say, I'm going to be talking about this, because that lowers your level of diction. So if I were writing this paper, I would notice 2 things. I would notice that I've only mentioned 2 elements of fiction, and I'm supposed to mention 3 elements of fiction, so I would clean that up. And I would notice that I am announcing my thesis, and I would stop doing that. That's what I would do. And so if you view the PowerPoint this week, you'll stop doing that. And I think folks who are continually announcing your thesis in this way, you know, it may be that you haven't gone and reviewed the resource I provided for you. You need to do that, and we're going to do it together this week. And then the other thing, once I've established my thesis, the other thing I would notice as I roll on down, okay, I'm doing a pretty good job. First paragraph is about point of view, and point of view is bam right there in the topic sentence of that paragraph. Then another key element is characterization. Bam, there's element number 2. But then I go down and I see literary techniques are another element. Well, no, they're not an element. And then I'm looking at paragraph, let's see where we are, 1, 2, 3. The fourth paragraph down talks about images. Well, images are not mentioned in the thesis statement. Now, I understand that the student is attempting to attach, to say this creation of images is another literary technique, but my mind remembers that images are not predicted in the thesis statement. And then I see something about symbols that isn't predicted in the thesis statement. So all of that makes that essay pull itself to pieces. It destroys itself because the thesis statement doesn't control the entire essay. So the other thing that I would notice as I was writing this essay is I'd say, well, I've got down here 2/3 of the way down here, and I'm talking about stuff that I didn't promise to talk about in my thesis, and so I've got to make that match. Now it makes sense, since you've written some pretty good stuff here, don't change the body paragraph, change the thesis statement, make it match. Remember, the thesis statement, once you write it, is a promise to your reader that you are obligated to keep. And if you find yourself breaking your promise, you go back and change the promise and keep at it till everything matches. Okay, so this actually wasn't a bad paper. I've had, there were papers that were much worse than this. There were papers that I was like, I don't know what the hell's going on. I can't help this person. This one was good because it had that one particular problem that could be identified and could be fixed easily and quickly by paying attention and by using the resources. So the last thing that I think that's not relevant to this paper, the last thing that some people have in their heads, which is not true, is that you write the thing from top to bottom. Because think about it, you pick up an essay, you read it from top to bottom, most likely you read it from intro to conclusion, but almost never is an essay written that way. That's why the drafting process is so incredibly critical. Because when I write an essay, 9 times out of 10, if I start with a thesis statement that's clearly defined, I'm going to depart from that thesis statement at some point in the essay. So why bother writing a thesis statement until the essay is written? Because you don't know where you're going until you get there. So I start in the middle somewhere. I start with what I know. If I've got an assignment, say, okay, literary elements in short fiction, before I even think I'm going to put on paper what I know, literary element setting, bam, 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 right in the middle. So I'm going to write that down on a piece of paper, and that's where I'm going to start writing. And setting may end up not being the first thing I cover, but setting is the first thing that came to my mind, so I write that down because that starts the thought process. So when I write an essay, most of the time, I write it from the inside out. I start somewhere in the middle, and then I write towards the top and towards the bottom, and then on my second draft, then I start to organize it. And sometimes I don't write a thesis statement because the thesis statement is the most important sentence in your essay. I don't write that most important sentence until I'm done because I don't know where I'm going until I get there. So again, none of this is rocket science. This is not terribly hard. In fact, compare it to advanced analytics and chemistry, or trigonometry. Compare it to those exact sciences. This stuff is a walk in the park. This is easy stuff, but you got to pay attention to what you're doing, and remember that the thing starts with a mass of material, and then you shape it using the techniques of this class into a beautifully crafted essay. But almost never, even when I write a very simple essay, I almost never write, intro, thesis, body 1, body 2, body 3, conclusion. I almost never write that way. it comes out that way. I craft it into that shape, and I make that structure for it in the process of writing, but I almost never write that way. So I think it may be, in my experience, a lot of you are trying to write top to bottom and thinking that's you're done. When you start at the top, you get to the bottom and you're done. No, you've begun at that point. And the easiest place to begin is where it's easy for you. Start with what you know, write that down, and then write sideways, up, down, however, circular, however the process works for you. Start with what you know and write out from that. And when the thing is in pretty good shape, once you've generated, organized, and revised, then edit it into the beautiful essay structure with a clear thesis statement, because then the thesis statement becomes easy to write because you know where you've been, because you've already arrived, and then all you have to do is go back and write the intro that tells your reader, who's coming along behind you and following the process. That helps your reader understand where you're going, and it also makes for a better thesis statement. So we're going to read that. You're going to look at that PowerPoint this week, and we're going to discuss that. And thanks again to your colleague who provided this essay for us, because it was that one problem that was easily identified and easily repaired. This wasn't one of those horrible monsters that's all over the place that I don't have a clue about. This was a pretty good essay, but had that one big problem. And the reason I used it is because a fair number of you are still having the same issue with thesis statements. And I was hoping that that thing would kind of go away on its own, because it's not primarily what we're teaching in this class. That's what they taught in the last class. And so I was reluctant to take the time to review it, but clearly we need to do that. So that's what this discussion this week is about. And again, remember, don't compare yourself to each other. Be supportive, be helpful, give each other advice. But, you know, writer A and writer B are two entirely different people. You can't expect them to write the same. You can expect them to achieve the same level of excellence, but probably in different ways. So don't compare yourself to the person sitting next to you. Compare yourself using these techniques and yourself not using these techniques. Yourself using these techniques will absolutely guaranteed be better. Okay, that's it. Bye.